RevOpsAF, the only podcast for people who are RevOpsAF and want to learn all about things that are RevOpsAF.
Our goal is to give the revenue operations community, that includes marketing, sales, and CS, for any of you not paying attention, the skills needed to accelerate their careers.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of RevOpsAF, the podcast. I am your co-host, Matthew Volm, and today we are talking with Kristina Diederich, who is a VP of RevOps many times over at prior companies like ECI and Vericent. We are going to be talking all about ICP, specifically going into what is an ICP, how can you define it, and then how and why you should pressure test your ICP, which sounds a lot easier than it actually is. And Kristina has a couple of real life examples that she's experienced in the past as a VP of RevOps that she's going to walk us through, and some of the outcomes that those sort of initiatives has driven. So Kristina, welcome. Why don't you first tell us a little bit about your professional journey into RevOps, because that's always interesting. People never go to college to get a degree in revenue operations. So I'm always fascinated by the way people landed there. So tell us a little bit more about yourself.
That is very true. When I graduated college, I thought I was going to go into biochemistry, and here I am in revenue operations.
Yeah.
So definitely took a left turn somewhere off the track. But I fell into sales and revenue operations about 15 years ago. I was at a company, Sykes Enterprises, that was doing an acquisition, and I was fortunate enough to be working closely with our executive vice president of sales at the time. He asked if I would be interested in a role that dealt with sales, financial planning, and financial analysis. I said, sure. And I tumbled right before sales operations became the buzzword in 2009. I never left and made the leap from the outsourcing world into SaaS-based businesses in 2016. So it's kind of been a whirlwind there.
Yeah. From biochemistry to RevOps, like I said, very natural leap, but I think that demonstrates the natural curiosity that a lot of people in revenue operations have, and also what makes you successful in that type of role. Makes a lot of sense to me, but I'm not going to quiz you on anything biochemistry related because one, it's not biochemistry AF, and two, I know nothing about that topic either. So let's talk a little bit about ICP, ideal customer profile. I guess first, I think like you say that term, right? And everyone's like, yeah, I know what that is. But I think like most things, a lot of people probably have maybe different definitions or different ways that they view that. So first, let's set the stage there. How do you view and define ICP, ideal customer profile?
Your ideal customer profile should be a customer or a prospect that you fit into their niche, where you fit into their tech stack, and some of their basic use cases, right? So if you think that you are a SaaS-based company that serves primarily retail or travel industry, you would want to look at your customer base and understand what customers look like and act like that spend a lot, have room for growth, and where some of their competitors are, or where your white space is out there, that you could find other customers that look like them.
Yeah. And that all makes sense in theory. I think the hard part is actually putting down on paper what your ICP should look like and doing that in a way that is data-driven, or at least backed by data. And I know a lot of times, and I'm probably guilty of this myself in the past, you kind of wind up saying like, oh, well, our ICP is, we're going after like early stage software companies, right? And we're trying to sell into marketing. And if you ask like one more question, like, oh, why? Like probably wouldn't have an answer for you, right? It's just like, well, that's just what I think, right? And so why is it so hard to actually define and measure your ICP? Because again, the definition that you just provided makes total sense. And I hear that, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. But then how do you actually look at your current customer base and actually pull out the right characteristics, whether it's company related or people related? Why is that so hard to do?
I think a lot of people base their ICP on a hunch. You ideally have this utopia in your mind of what the size customer you want, what your average deal size is that you're targeting. And so you just kind of decide that this is what you're going to do. I was at a company that said their ICP was any customer over 100 million, which was true in some cases, but in other cases, when you actually looked at even some of their existing customer bases, they had some customers that fit into that sub 100 million profile that spent six figures with them annually and was way over their average ARR that they were targeting, even for new logo customers. When you start uncovering what your current customer base is, it's very hard to make a blanket statement of how much somebody is going to spend with you. If you have in this case, sub $100 million company that maybe has a majority of its revenue coming from its online presence, and the particular company I was at, that's what drove usage and consumption, ergo revenue.
Yeah. So let's talk, I think there's kind of two elements of ICP, at least for folks as we look at this through a B2B lens. So one are company attributes. You mentioned one of them just now, annual revenue. What are some other common or even less common ways that you've seen companies leverage company attributes, and what were they to define their ICP?
Yeah, it really depends what you're selling. At a company like Verison, where you are selling a sales compensation platform, you're going to look at the number of employees, because what drives revenue and usage for you is how many people are on a commission plan. In other companies, like when I worked at Akamai, I was in the cybersecurity division. It was all license-based based on how many employees you had, because you were trying to do the whole VPN displacement. So how many employees equaled how many licenses you would have to sell. At other organizations, it was really driven by their website traffic. So you can have anything from your employee count, your annual revenue, what industry you're in. If you're in an industry driven by online e-commerce or website traffic, like travel and hospitality, most of that is booked through online bookings. And obviously, if your hotel or whatever is looking sparkly and new in all of its pictures, you're going to obviously have more people wanting to book there just because of the way the image loads or a video plays.
Yeah. So company attributes that you consider for developing your ICP should be tied to revenue, the dollar amount of deals
What drives your revenue?
What drives your revenue, which makes sense. The thing to consider, and again, this sounds obvious, but don't default to maybe the data points that are easier to collect. Like you said, in those examples that you've provided, say your sales compensation software, total number of employees could be a proxy for the number of salespeople. So consider that. But if you can get number of actual like sales team heads, right? Like that should be your first priority, which is different from the example you gave that maybe it's based on website visitors or traffic, right? Which may not be tied at all to employee size. And so when you're developing your ICP and looking at these company characteristics to use, sure, you might be able to collect employee size, but that shouldn't be the first thing that you look at when putting together those company attributes for your ICP.
That you would want to look, SimilarWeb or Built With, they sometimes have ways that you can estimate how much traffic somebody is getting to their website. The other thing that is oftentimes overlooked, especially when you look at companies that are smaller in size or startups with a lot of funding, is how much funding do they have? Their revenue may only be $10 million right now, but they may have $150 million in backing. If your ICP is that line in the sand at 100 million, a company that has 150 million in backing may be somebody for you to go after because you get in on the ground floor and then they grow with you, which if you're a usage-based company is going to continue to drive your revenue.
Yep. No, that totally makes sense. And outside of, talked a little bit about the company attributes side. The other aspect of this is deals get done by people, right? People on the selling side, right, are making deals with people on the buying side. Oftentimes it's more than one person. You're interacting and engaging with people at these companies that you're trying to determine if they're a good fit or not. What are the things that folks should be thinking about the people side of characteristics and attributes to help them develop that part of the ICP that'll obviously go along with?
Over the years, despite the fact that I am not actually a sales rep, I have done numerous sales trainings. One of the biggest things they always teach you is learning about the buyer journey. So the WIFM, right? What's in it for me? If you think about your use cases or the why somebody should buy your product, that naturally falls into who should be buying it. In some cases, maybe it's your e-commerce site and that should be somebody in marketing. Maybe it's a developer, that should be somebody in IT. It really depends on the product that you're selling and the why, but you have to think of the use cases and how it ties back to what is it going to do for the customer. In a lot of cases, it was funny because I remember at Verison, they targeted HR. And I sat there for a while one day and I was like, here, I'm the one that does commissions. Like, your buyer is also sales ops or sales, right? Because they're really the ones that are driven. HR is part of your total compensation package. But thinking about the people who have a stake in the product that you're buying on the buyer side.
And what's interesting is part of what you just mentioned is that the people side of this can be different depending on company size or stage or some of those attributes we talked about. Makes sense to think about the use case and what's in it for me, right? Think about the value you're delivering to the buyer and the common characteristics across things like job title and seniority level. The other side of this equation, and my question for you is, as you start to get into that, you might have different types of ICPs or more than one type of buyer persona or ICP. Because like you said, at a company you were in RevOps building this product for people in RevOps. Given your size and stage and your expertise, that responsibility you owned. Could be very different if you were at a much larger company or a much smaller company. Even thinking about folks who are like, oh, we really need director level or above, or you're probably not a fit. But to your point, what if you're, say, earlier stage company, or maybe you're a growing company and you are a manager level there, right? You may have the decision-making power, you might have the budget to make those decisions, and you have the need for a potential product, right? So you could be excluding those people. How should people think about the number of ideal customer profiles that they should define for the products they're selling? Is it dependent on the complexity of your business and what size or stage you're at? Is it something else? How narrow should you get?
So I think narrow, unless you're in a very niche market, becomes detrimental to your own growth. Because at some point, there's a finite point of market penetration, right? Where you're not necessarily going to get more of that particular whatever. And your competitors are always going to come out with something that's going to compete against you. And that market share is going to go back and forth. I think there's a key to understanding that you may have a different ICP depending on your product set. So for one product set, you may have one ICP. For another product set, you may have another ICP. I think you could also have different ICPs when you go across industries, right? So going back to my original example, if you're in a e-commerce, retail, travel, hospitality, your ICP may look different than if you go into a manufacturing company or an automotive company, right? Because there's a different baseline of when somebody would really use your product optimally. And then if you think about within each of these companies, you basically have a decision tree. When you went back to the question of, is a manager the right level for you to talk to? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the company, right? In some worlds, my role is a VP. In other worlds, it's a senior director. It really depends on the organization and how they view and value titles. But the fact is that if you're in RevOps, we all kind of do the same thing: forecasting, territory quota planning, and defining your ICP. So one of the key things to think of when you're building out your ICP is looking at the titles and the roles that each of these companies have. And maybe it's an industry-wide thing, but it doesn't hurt to reach up and down the chain, because the reality is at some point, somebody becomes an influencer. I know I've had my own teams in the past when we're evaluating tech. Am I the ultimate decision maker? Yes. But do I want the value of my team that's going to use it every day and the buy-in that they're going to use it every day, whether that be a sales leader or one of my partners or even somebody, an analyst for whatever product that you're buying? And I think sometimes we get lost that it's important on the buyer side too.
That makes sense. I think So kind of, again, sounds obvious, but tie everything back to the way that people make buying decisions, which can be hard to do because you are in the position of selling. But I think that's the key here is, look at it from the buyer's point of view. And if you start there and develop those company and people attributes to put together your ICP, you'll be in a good spot. I want to ask you about one other thing, though. So obviously, people know who their customers are. Companies know who their customers are. They can collect data about those customers and run some quick analysis, even if it's in a spreadsheet. Like most of our customers are in this band of number of employees, they're in this revenue range, they're in these sets of industries, right? Whatever it is, they can come up with something relatively easily. But you can't have this be a one and done sort of thing. It can be hard to continuously pressure test those assumptions or even the hunches that people have on, oh, I think my ICP is this, but if you ask them why, they don't have anything to back it up. So talk a little bit about how often or frequently you should recommend people revisit the definition of their ICP with company and people characteristics. Then we'll get into some of the examples and outcomes that you can drive in doing this, because I know you've got some specific things that you've experienced in the past that have led to increased revenue there. But let's talk first about the cadence or maybe frequency for revisiting your ICP. What do you recommend to people there?
I would definitely say once a year. Once a year, take a look at your customer base, because you're going to go through churn. And if you see churn in a specific industry, there's probably some kind of turnover or something going on in that specific realm of your world that maybe for a while don't invest so much in going and getting new customers in that industry or in that certain company size. Could be a competitor in the market, could be a number of things. But I think
that's interesting, actually, because I think we've been talking about ICP as ideal customer profile, but there's also folks who are a bad fit, right? And you won't necessarily know until you experience some of those who is a bad fit. So that's the flip side to consider. Obviously, you'll have folks who are a great fit based on longevity, like how long they've been around, but you also don't exclude the people that have churned or left. Maybe look at them too and see what common threads exist here. What can I learn about who a bad fit customer is?
Because everybody has a finite number of salespeople. If you think about how much time they have and how many accounts they can really work, most places, again, have a finite revenue budget, right? Where do you want the most bang for your buck, and where can you focus your efforts? Back in 2020, restaurants were kind of on the verge of failure because we were told to stay home and not go to restaurants. You probably saw a lot of restaurants closing and going out of business because they couldn't sustain themselves without customers coming in. If you think about, you see a lot of churn in that restaurant or hospitality industry for a while, maybe don't focus your energy there. But if you see e-commerce spiking because people can't go to stores, but they can still shop online, I think you have a different dynamic of how to market to those people, given the state of the economy and other things that are going on. So if you take a look at what's churning and what's moving in your customer base, I think it'll give you a lot of clues as to what your ICP is.
Yeah. And that's probably a good way to segment things for folks who are listening and thinking where they can start or what they can do. Look at 3 different buckets. One, who are customers that have been around for a while, longevity. What does a long-term successful customer look like for you? Second bucket would be like recent customers, right? Like maybe look at last 3 months, 6 months, like you said, get a feel for the new folks coming in and compare those to the customers. Compare those to where you've seen success and see if they match up. Because like you said, you could be learning about some new trend. To go back to RevOps, like you brought up sales ops in the late 2000s, right? Like the new, sort of buzzword. It was 4 or 5 years ago that RevOps started coming around. If you go back to the sales comp or the compensation software product, if you were looking at this 4 years ago, 3 years ago, you probably would have seen that a lot of folks with RevOps titles were part of this new customer base that you were having. So I think looking at that second bucket of recent customers is an important one. And then the third one is what we talked about before, the bad fit folks, right? Like look at who's churned, who's left, who hasn't bought anything in a long time to get a sense
Who's not eating what they've already bought.
Yeah, exactly. Like get a sense for who is not a good fit for you. And I think those three things will give you a really good sense of how do I get more long-term customers? What trends are we seeing in new customer acquisition that are important? And what does a bad fit churned customer look like? Because that can influence where you market, how you define your ICP for your sales folks, all of that. So I think those are very important. We talked about at least revisiting this again once per year, probably dependent on how much change you're going through as a business. The earlier stage you are, the more frequently you want to make sure you're revisiting your ICP. Yeah. But let's talk about, because I know you've got some, at least like one example as when you were in a VP role. And I think coming into a new company, you pressure tested the ICP assumptions that you were given, learned some things, and produced some outcomes. So walk us through that particular example, how you approach things and some of the outcomes that you drove.
Yeah. I had started this company, came in, and they handed me this deck that was around the ICP. They had defined early in the year prior to my joining. I was going through it, and it was well thought out. You could see where they pulled all the data together based on their Salesforce org and their customer list and everything. But I started looking at the bookings they had year to date to that point. And when I started categorizing the companies they had closed in the previous 4 or 5 months since they defined the ICP, and then I realized that 40% of what they were closing was actually in the segment that was outside of their ICP, in this sub $100 million bucket. And then I started getting curious because it was a question of, well, if 40% of your time is being spent closing these customers, and some customers are actually at or above the average deal value that you're looking for, what is in your customer base? I pulled the list of 600 plus customers, kind of started going through them just quick, obviously Zoom info data that's hooked up to our Salesforce, and figuring out where they all landed and what their average ARR was across the board. And when I started looking, I saw, okay, yes, in most cases, let's say 60% of the time, these customers are your sub 50K annual revenue. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is a bad thing. It just means that they're smaller customers, but these should also be quick sales cycles for us. And then I looked at kind of those, I'll call them this super group that basically had at or above our average ARR. And I noticed these were companies heavily reliant on doing business through their website. And obviously we were a consumption-based business based on website traffic. And so that was what was really driving the revenue. One was an NFT company that spent 6 figures, but was sub 50 million in revenue, but had $100 million in backing. And so I started realizing that we needed an adjustment of our ICP, but we did it in 2 different ways. We did it in not necessarily saying $100 million was our cutoff, but there was also a piece that said we needed to go define our sales strategy around acquisition of these smaller customers. But going a step beyond that, we needed a pricing package that we could go to them with, because some of these deals we were probably losing because we weren't priced right for these customers. Once we developed new pricing strategy specifically for these smaller companies, took 2 people, targeted them at these companies, we closed over $500,000 in business in about 5.5 months doing this targeted approach that, was probably at least half of it we would not have gotten otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I guess a couple of things that you mentioned that I liked about that. One, you were very intentional and sequential in the way you approached this. You just peeled back the onion one layer at a time and you didn't get too far ahead of yourself. And then when you discovered, you peeled back all those layers that you could on the analysis side, you then didn't just dive headfirst or all in and be like, oh my God, the sky is falling. We've been wrong all the time. Let's go and change everything that we're doing. You said, hey, let's take 1, 2 people and develop this approach, right? I've thought of kind of developed the problem, the solution of adjusting our pricing, having a package that we can sell. Let's now try this out with a couple of people and see what results we get. And then you actually measured the results, which sounds simple and obvious, but something that people often forget. And then that produces this nice little feedback loop that you can include into the rest of your revenue engine. Now you essentially have two ICPs with different sales cycles and different offerings and ways that you're delivering value to them. You were intentional about it and you thought about it from the buyer's perspective, not necessarily the way you wanted to sell to them.
That was key because having a package that was the right size for these, let's call them quick wins, we set targets for ourselves. We said if our average cycle is 120 days, we want this average cycle to be less than 90. And then once we figure out how to get it to 90, we're going to get it to 60 because ideally these are like 45-day sales cycles where somebody comes in, we show them how it works, good, we're off, we're done. We also knew that because in some of these cases, not all of them are going to spend 6 figures with us, right? And so putting together content and enablement around it, can we do a canned demo? If a demo looks like this, specifically for this use case, can we build something that's a 5-minute video or something that's simple enough that our sales rep can walk a customer or prospect through without necessarily needing SE support? Because all of that cost of acquisition is going to start playing into this, especially if you only bring in somebody with 30K average deal size. But if you get enough 30K deals, you may close $1 million in a year in this subsegment of 100 million. You don't necessarily want to turn away from it either.
Yeah, 100%. And so I have one more question for you. It is not RevOps or ICP related at all, because we've gone through that journey of what is an ICP? How do you look at company attributes? How do you look at people attributes? How do you make sure the two are married together? And then how do you continuously pressure test and evaluate your ICP? What are some of the outcomes that you can drive when you do that effectively? We just kind of walk through all of that. So here's my non-RevOps related question for you. For folks who are watching, I've got some information on RevOpsAF, our annual conference. We're hosting our US conference in New Orleans in May of 2025 and our EMEA event in Berlin, Germany in June of 2025. So I want to use the conference to set the stage. Imagine you are the opening keynote speaker for RevOpsAF in New Orleans. We're going to have 350 people there in the crowd. So you're the opening keynote speaker. We call your name and you are entering stage left. Everybody's standing up, screaming. They're all super excited for Kristina to take the stage. As you're walking up on stage, what would be your walk-up song or the music that you would play as you came onto stage to deliver the opening keynote for RevOpsAF?
A hard one. I needed to think about this before.
As you're thinking about it, I'll tell you, we have gotten a variety of answers before. Everything from AC/DC to someone brought up Smooth Operator, tied in like the RevOps thing. Someone even said,
Sound of music.
There's no wrong answer. I would say like anything that's on your Spotify or Apple Music playlist. What's something that gets you hyped up?
You know, I think as a RevOps partner, we live and die by the revenue teams that we support, whether that's sales, account management, CS. So I'm going to have to go with DJ Khaled's All I Do Is Win.
Yeah, nice.
Make revenue.
Yep. I like that. And fun fact for everybody, last year at our conference, which was in San Diego, we did have a well-known revenue operator do karaoke to that song. DJ Khaled. Yep. And we're going to have a karaoke stage at the conference in New Orleans, just saying. So if anybody listening or you, Kristina, want to get up on karaoke stage, you're more than welcome.
I assure you it will not be karaoke. Dance with 5 lines to comedy.
There you have it. From what we started with biochemistry, then we got into ICP, and then we ended with walk-up songs and karaoke adventures to All I Do Is Win. Thank you very much, Kristina, for joining, for dropping some knowledge on folks. That's all I got for you, though, so I'll let you run. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode, everybody.
For more great content like this, join our community at RevOpsCoop.com and check out the links provided in the show notes.
Keep it RevOpsAF, y'all.